Thank you for joining me. I'm excited to see you guys. So let's pray, and then we'll get started. Father, thank you so much that you love us. Thank you for just always being with us, for meeting us where we are. Thank you for being the Lord of history and writing it in such a beautiful way. I pray that you would help us to really enjoy this time together. Thank you for giving us this time. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so I have been reading a book called Reclaiming Quiet, and it is basically about that, right? I've been going on lots of walks and just kind of being with the Lord. It's been really nice. But she says, one of the things, the woman who writes it, her name's Sarah Clarkson, and she says, time is not neutral, but rather the soil of life, out of which will grow whatever we choose to plant. And I love that because a lot of times I think we are a little more neutral with our time. We'll watch Netflix or we'll do whatever, and it just kind of whiles away. And I'm just thankful that you have come and you are planting seeds here, like with me right now. It's just amazing. I'm honored. So anyway, I'm Bethany Yousefi, or Mrs. Yousefi, because there are some students here. And so most of you I know. And you know that I have an art degree, art history degree, and an English degree from Washington College. But when I was in college, I never studied this dome. I have to click it, don't I? Yes. I'm going to get used to it. I'm controlling it with this, but also clicking on my computer. So I don't know how I missed this in college. It's amazing, and it kind of kicked off the Renaissance. But what I knew about Florence was actually, why isn't it working? Okay, we did do a run through. It did work. There we go. Okay, from this movie. Does anybody know what this movie is? It's While You Were Sleeping. Yes. And so Sandra Bullock, she marries this guy, which is the spoiler. But if you haven't seen it, it's been out for 30 years. So. And he gives her a little snow globe, and she really just wanted to go to Florence. So he gives her a stamp in her passport for their wedding, and it is the Duomo, which I had seen this movie when I was young. I loved it. Always wanted to go to Florence because Sandra Bullock went to Florence. So that was all I knew about it. It is called the Santa Maria del Fiore, which it's pretty breathtaking, even in pictures, isn't it? And it means the Lady of the Flowers. I'll get used to this. And the reason why is because in Florence, it's basically like a fleur-de-lis, which we would recognize from France. But in Florence, they have it with stamens coming out, too. So if you see one with no stamens, that's France. And the ones with stamens are Florence. It's actually an iris, yeah? So sometimes, we even ran into this earlier, you'll see the Florentine people even represent themselves with irises in art, which is really cool. So when I started teaching about 10 years ago, I realized I probably should learn something about the Renaissance since I skipped that whole thing in college. And so I read this book. And I absolutely recommend this book, especially I know a few of you are going to Florence this summer. Read this book. It has some of the information in it that I am sharing today, but it'll just knock your socks off. Ross King has done more research in one lifetime than I think normal people would do in 4 lifetimes. It's amazing, and he uses a lot of primary resources. So this is where most of this talk is from today. So we're going to start here because you can't go to Florence without at least talking about this guy for a second. He's a little earlier than when the dome came to be. He is Dante, and what did Dante write? The Divine Comedy, that's right. And actually, in the Divine Comedy, he talks about 2 artists that we'll mention briefly, but he is from Florence, and that is important. in the design of the dome. So this is his layers of hell that are represented by Botticelli, who comes later in the Renaissance. But I just kind of want you to see how it has these different layers that go down. And we'll come back to that. But he talks about two artists. One is named Cimabue, and one is Giotto. And he says, Cimabue, at first, he thought he won the field. He thought he was the best artist there had ever been. But then Giotto came, and he eclipsed him. And we'll actually end up seeing some of Giotto's work today. So around the time that Dante was living in Florence, Arnolfo di Cambio came, and he was not a guy from Florence, but he wanted to go because he could see things were starting to take shape in Florence. Even the fact that Dante wrote the Divine Comedy without Latin, he wrote it in the vernacular, and so all of a sudden people are like, "Oh, we can talk about this. We can understand." In the Middle Ages, basically, people were trying to survive, right? You're trying to work, and you would go to church to listen to whatever stories you were hearing, but a lot of that was in Latin. So you don't have a lot of time for extra thought, for reading. Most people weren't literate. So there's not a lot of thought that is pushing things forward into development. And then this kind of turn happens right around the time that Dante is living in Florence. It's one of the reasons that Di Cambio comes to Florence. It's Cimabue. He's starting to look at things, and he's like, I'm not going to make flat art. I'm going to start to draw the things the way I see them. And so all of a sudden, there becomes this explosion. And the only thing that I can say about it is that it has to be God, just kind of lighting a spark in people. Right? It kind of started to feel like an Olympic village where there were so many people who are really at the top of their game in terms of what they're starting to think and how they're starting to be. And they're both competing against each other and also spurring each other on in that competition to be better. So, let me see. Arnolfo, he draws this picture of a church, and he's like, I want this in Florence, and I want my name on it. I want to be known for this. It's done in a Romanesque style, and it has this beautiful dome at the top because he has seen the domes from ancient Rome, but no one knows how to do a dome in the 1200s because those domes were made, hundreds of years before, and that knowledge has been lost because everyone is just trying to survive, right? So here is a Romanesque church. I wanted to show you that. This is actually the Duomo. So it has a kind of cross shape, which I think is really beautiful, and it's central in Florence. It's the biggest dominant part of their skyline. So he starts out. Oh, I better catch up on this one. Sorry, guys. In 1296. He draws that little drawing, and they get on their way. They love the idea. But because no one knows how to build the roof of it, they start to build all of the surrounding part. And for many, many years, they don't have any roof. And it's actually, this is painted in the 1360s. Remember, it was 1296 that he had designed it. By the 1360s, they still were no farther. This guy, he had painted this picture, and it's much easier to paint a picture than it is to actually, put stones together and to cross this huge expanse and make them float, basically. So they end up just having a church with no roof for 125 years. Yeah, it's a long time. And this is not the actual church, it's just kind of a representation. But along comes Filippo Brunelleschi, and he is probably a genius. I would like to meet him. He lived at the same time as Leonardo. Leonardo's a little bit younger than he is. But you can see, even in this etching, he's got a picture of the dome here because he had lots of things that he gave to the early Renaissance, but this was his biggest contribution. So he was a goldsmith. He trained as a goldsmith, and he apprenticed under the wool guild. In Florence at the time, there were all different guilds. So kind of like, if you like gardening and I like gardening, green thumbs, right? We'll be green thumbs together. We'll start a club. But here they had like the bankers and the merchants and the wool and all the metal workers. So I really love this one. I just think is the most beautiful. So I think he was part of the most beautiful one. But they decided to host competitions in order to make it easier for the artists to get commissions to win, in order to hopefully beautify the city in lots of different ways. This is the baptistry that is attached. It's not attached, but it is part of the complex of the church. This tower right here, this tower is actually Giotto's tower, and Giotto is the one who eclipsed Cimabue in Dante's little poem, part of like back when they were alive. So he actually, for a little while during that time when nobody knew how to build the roof on, they had him be the head architect. And even he, who was the best painter, could not make it happen. But he did, at least. We have this tower from him. So the baptistry, the Merchants Guild, they start a competition. And this is harder than I thought it would be. I'm feeling all over the place. I'm sorry. So they start a competition, and they have these two men as front runners to make the doors for the baptistry church into something very beautiful. Because they're like, if we can't span the roof, we've got to do something to make this beautiful and interesting. And we'll just keep doing it until maybe someone finds the ingenuity to do this dome. So Ghiberti and Brunelleschi are both metal workers at the time, and they both do a sample. And we actually still have the exact samples that they created for the competition, and you can see them in Florence. So does anyone recognize what this scene is? It's an Old Testament scene. Because you know what it is. I feel like I should answer. Moses' son. Yes, exactly. So it's not Moses' son, it's Abraham's son. So it is the sacrifice of Isaac. And it's done, two different ways through their interpretation. And the Merchants Guild picks Ghiberti to win. And so he actually goes on, let me see, to spend the next few decades working on the doors. And they are called, so he does 2 sets of doors. He wins the first set, then he wins the second set, and they're the gates of paradise. But a lot of times when we're disappointed by something, because Brunelleschi was incredibly disappointed that he lost this commission, when God disappoints us, I try to tell my kids this, he appoints us to something else. And if Brunelleschi had not lost to Ghiberti here, we would never have gotten the dome. Because he goes with his friend, Donatello, of Ninja Turtle fame, right? Donatello is about 10 years younger than him, and he is an aspiring sculptor. They both go to Rome together, and Rome at the time is pretty much in ruins between fire and invading armies, earthquakes, just neglect because so many people have died and left the city. they're just literally, I kind of imagine them as bums walking around with like a notebook and a knapsack, just like taking measurements of things. I think it would have been amazing to be a part of that. But importantly, Brunelleschi has to take architectural measurements, especially of the Pantheon. It is probably the best dome for him to be looking at, and he's up close to it. So Donatello, as a sculptor, is kind of measuring everything in the round that he can walk around, even if they're on the ground. It's easy for him to measure. And then literally, Brunelleschi is measuring and climbing and trying to figure out how did they float the stones. So what he comes back to Florence with is this plan that he's going to have one dome and then some ribs of wood, and then the dome that you would see on the outside. So this kind of double dome is going to be what the one dome is going to hold the other one, which they can't even imagine. They like cannot trust it. And what he does is he uses Dante's Inferno. He inverts it, the layers of hell, and he uses them as the rib inspiration inside, just to kind of pay homage to the fellow Florentine who came before him, which I think is just beautiful. Because, like, not everybody's going to ever know that, but he'll know that he did that for him. So the Wool Guild that he had been a part of, they hosted another competition, and they wanted to see a plan that involved wooden centering. Wooden centering was going to be the wood that holds all the stones up while they dry with the mortar. Because if you don't have anything, what's going to hold it up while it's drying? It's just going to cave in. So he submits his design, and no other than Ghiberti submits his design, who had beaten him out for the doors. But Ghiberti, his design has centering. And they like that Brunelleschi's does not have centering because it's so much less expensive. They don't even know how they're going to have wood that big to span everything. So they decide to award the competition to both men, which Brunelleschi is very unhappy with, obviously. So actually, I'll go back. Sorry. So he decides to not write anything down. He keeps everything in his head, and he says, Ghiberti, you go ahead and start work on this. And then he gets deathly ill and doesn't come to work for months. And Ghiberti is kind of left there not knowing even how to begin. So they fire him. The guild fires him. And immediately, Brunelleschi makes an amazing recovery, which is so good. Good for him. And so he returns to work, and he ends up overseeing this project where he taught them about an oculus, where the stones are going to converge at the top, and the pressure of that is going to keep them from falling. He taught them about the herringbone pattern that they were going to have to make the bricks in. He even taught all the bricklayers how to cut each brick into what dimension. He had to create an incredible amount of pulleys and levers and all of these even things just to get all of the supplies up to the top. And in all of it, in all the years it took to build, they only lost one man, which is really impressive considering how many men would have been working on the project. Okay. And in 1436, They had a parade, which I think is very Olympic Village, right? Even like the flags and the different people. So these are the different guilds. And here is his wool guild. They have a parade during the Feast of Annunciation, and they open the church. And they actually celebrate with cheese and macaroni, which I think is fantastic that they note that. Humanity never changes. So he lives long enough to see that. And he has designs for a huge lantern to go on the top. And he doesn't live long enough to see the lantern go up. But this guy does. And in fact, not only does he see it go up, he actually has a hand in it. So the reason I think this is so neat is just that God has taken all of these different people and he weaves our stories individually, like our disappointments and our opportunities, and all through our lives, right? He's very good at being intentional in our lives. But then he also is weaving all of your lives with mine. He is weaving all of these men's lives together in this very beautiful tapestry that just tells one story, right? And it points to his glory. And so this is where it gets really interesting in my mind, because Leonardo is famous in his own right. But here, he actually helps. He works with this guy. This is Verrocchio, and he is an apprentice under Verrocchio. Verrocchio gets the commission to build the lantern. So Leonardo, I guess it would help if I did it up here. Leonardo actually writes in his notebooks, remember the way we soldered the ball of Santa Maria del Fiore. And he is thinking through this ball. Over here, these are Brunelleschi's, one of his inventions that Leonardo had sketched while he was in Florence looking up. This is the note that he's taking, and this is many years later, and he's trying to figure out something about mirrors. And he literally writes that note to himself, remember the ball that we soldered. And the fact he would have been maybe 16, 17-ish, somewhere in there, when he helped put the ball on the top of the lantern. But I think it's very neat that probably the Renaissance most famous man had a hand in this. Also, I like to point this out. This is one of Verrocchio's paintings, and this is the moment that Leonardo became really great. He actually, Verrocchio had him paint in these little angels, and if you can tell, they are very different looking. And Verrocchio said, wow, he has surpassed the master here. I can never paint again. So. I like to show my students this painting because you can actually see right here. That's the Duomo being built. Here you can see the scaffolding around the top of the Duomo. It's really a neat moment, a little testament to like, oh, this was happening. Okay. The next guy that was involved in a certain way, or at least that the dome touched, was Michelangelo. Well, first, hold on. Even before I get to the David, Michelangelo had a wet nurse when he was young. His mom died. And the wet nurse was actually the wife of a stonemason that Brunelleschi had taught how to chisel the stones for the roof. And he taught his wife how to chisel. And Michelangelo actually credits her in his notes with teaching him how to use a chisel, which is kind of amazing. Like, Brunelleschi probably had no idea he was going to help create one of the most prolific and best sculptors there ever was. So he sculpts the David. He's not very old when he does. But he sculpts it out of a piece of marble that had been picked out about 40 years prior And it took 2 years to come from the quarry down to the dome, where the Duomo was. And they wanted it up high on the Santa Maria del Fiore. But it was very strange. Like, the piece was not chosen well. And it was too narrow. And it was also too brittle. And so it had all these problems. And no one had wanted to actually attempt to carve it. And I think that's kind of like the dome itself, where no one knows how to attempt to put the dome on top, right? So he actually carves it without even doing a model, like a small model. He just starts, yeah. And you can kind of see from scale how large it is. It's really big. Yeah. And so I think it's neat that God has a sense of humor here, because that piece of marble, which was over 17 feet tall, the Florentine people nicknamed it the giant. And then he carved the David out of the giant, which I think is very funny. Okay. So this is the one where I feel like, oh, wow, this blew my mind. I called this talk Reaching the Spheres. And so it is a sphere, right? The dome is a sphere. And then also it reached up high into the atmosphere. But then this is the cool one, at least in my mind. The other sphere is the hemisphere. So Toscanelli was a friend of Brunelleschi's, and he was a cartographer, and he was a mathematician living in Florence. And he asked permission from Brunelleschi to use the dome and the oculus to make a sundial. It was the biggest sundial that had ever been, the tallest. And so he took all of this information, and he used all these new measurements to correct old measurements that were outdated and that people were using to sail. And he sent them to Portugal to Prince Henry the Navigator. And does anyone know who was there at the time? Yes, Liam. Yes. Good. And not everybody believed him. What he told them was, hey, I think from these new measurements that I'm taking in the dome, I think you can sail west to get to the Indies. And people, some of them were like, no, you can't. We're not going to trust that. And, oh, wait, hold on. There's the oculus. Sorry, guys. And Christopher Columbus took him up on it. And he said, I think you might be right. So Christopher Columbus actually sailed with his map, with Toscanelli's map, and his letter that he had sent after he did the math at the dome. And then, of course, that's why we're here, right? Yeah. So, actually, I might have talked kind of fast because I'm already done. This is my favorite sculpture of Brunelleschi. This is in the plaza, and he's looking up at the dome. And he's got a tool, a mathematics tool that he's working with. But I also love that I see him kind of looking up to the Lord too, like savoring it. That there's this moment of just awe and wonder. Anyway, Brunelleschi. Good? Okay. Well, I don't have much more for us. That was it. But anyway, does anybody have any questions?
I'm more of a comment. Like, one of the things I love about that story, and total commercial here, but if you look at something like that, it's not, it's only constructed by what we would call people who have a liberal arts education. So to construct it required a great deal of knowledge of math and science, perhaps greater than any person living today. Obviously an appreciation for art. It required an understanding of history because you've got people going to the Pantheon to study it. And some understanding of literature because he's copying Dante's Inferno. Like this is the embodiment of an embodiment of what we talk about in having a well-rounded liberal arts education. If you had one person who only spent their time on CAD or computer programming or something, they might be really good at that. But they would not be able to build this dome. They might be able to run a computer program that we would use to build it today, but that's not the same. And so it's really that full-orbed education that makes something like that possible.
Yeah. I also think like it has to like God's hand is here, right? Like this doesn't just happen. Even if you have all those different parts, right? To be able to figure this out and to have this last 600 years, it was an experiment, basically. So, yeah.
So from the time they started building, how long did it take to build it?
So from the time they started, like building the foundation, or the time from the dome, only 15 years.
Only.
Which, I mean, considering it had been 125, 15 feels like, a drop in the bucket. Yeah. Yeah. And then the lantern took a few more years. That was another like 30 years or so. Yeah. You can actually go up in between the two domes, like the inner one and the outer one. They have stairs. So you can climb to the top or to the lantern through those stairs. Yeah.
And Michelangelo built a plaza above. I don't know if you've been up there.
Oh, no, I haven't been to Florence yet. I know, I'm giving a talk on it.
Okay.
I know.
Well, you know a ton about the dome, but there's Michelangelo actually built a plaza above it, a similar viewpoint from this one,
Okay.
from which you can look down at the church. It's really
Oh, that's
spectacular.
awesome.
He was kind of a landscape architect among all of his many other things. He designed a plaza, a garden up above the city of Florence so that you could look down on the piazza.
That's really cool.
It's very cool.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm curious if you know or came across from reading any symbolic reasoning for a dome versus, say, any other structure on the roof, as for the roof. Like, why a dome?
It was, I think, truly to honor the classical style. Because they were like, well, they can do it there. It has to be done. There was also the Gothic kind of style in Milan, and the Florentines didn't like Milan. So they did not want to do anything that Milan was doing. So they were like, we have to make it look different. No flying buttresses, nothing else to support. That was, a different shape, all the things. Yeah, so that's kind of a mean reason, but yeah.
I don't know, I think it's a good way to do creativity.
Absolutely. Truly, there was a lot of fighting and a lot of competition. Like Leonardo, he actually, when Michelangelo made the David, and they wanted to display it, Leonardo voted against it because he didn't want Michelangelo to then become more popular than he was. Mm-hmm. He said it was because of public nudity, like that's just too much. But really, it was just because he didn't want him to get ahead. Sure.
The color of the tiles, was that the rest of the roofs in the city match that? Do you know which one came first? Was it
That's a good question.
glass
Glenn, do you know?
I would think very strongly that the dome is following the color of the roof tiles, but
And also, I would imagine where they're using like their quarries, they're probably there's probably a reason that those roofs are first that color because they're accessing different quarries.
yeah, that would have to be, it's gonna be a practical decision, and then they'll make the church follow it.
Yeah. Yes.
One of the, I had a chance to read that book that you're looking at,
Yeah.
and one of the parts of it that I thought was the most interesting is the way that he used the bricks and the herringbone and the brick so they could be stacked without having any other support other than themselves.
Yeah.
And
It was like a spiral herringbone.
yeah, and I think I had to read the section like 3 times. I'm like, I'm not understanding how this is possible.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, this is, you know, if you just talked about all of his different types of knowledge that he had. I mean, that is just, I mean, that's how he was able to build it without centering because he didn't need any support. It was self-supporting as he built it, which is kind of just unbelievable. So
It really is.
that's,
It does look like he's looking up to heaven. I think so too. Yeah. And this is a neoclassical sculpture, so this was built much later. But, I mean, neoclassical, new classical fits right in. The Renaissance guys were looking back at the classics too, so.
Would you mind going back to the sundial picture? Sorry, you mentioned it, but I didn't really appreciate it.
Sure, yeah. This was actually, it's a picture from inside the Duomo. I can't remember what date. Recently, I feel like 2012 or something. And then this is just a diagram.
Are there like particular, like it works at any time of the day? You can look at the floor and tell, I mean.
No. And actually, I read in one spot that he had to make a separate hole to make something work, but I only read it in one spot. So I'm a little bit unclear on how it works as a sundial. There is still the opening, though, I think, right? Yeah. And also, when he would have done that, I don't think the lantern was complete yet. So I don't know if the lantern would change how it would look now. Anyway, definitely go to the Dome. There's lots of art that I didn't talk about, but different statues, different paintings. It is, I mean, Florence, you could spend days and days in. Yes, Michael.
What architecture did Brunelleschi influence that came after him? He specifically said he's intentionally not trying to copy the Middle East. So, like, is anyone looking at this and saying, "Oh yeah, I'm going to duplicate that"?
Sure.
So, like, what influences he had on architecture in the immediate and then in the centuries to come?
Sure. So in France, if you look at Las Invalides, I didn't do a picture of it, but there's the hospital there with the gold dome. That's looking at his. And also we have one here in the Capitol building that actually looked at Brunelleschi's dome too. I don't know do you know other domes that particularly were looking? No, because one's like the smaller dome of the Hagia Sophia, for instance, was already made. But those are the two that I can think of off the top of my head.
So when are you gonna go to Florence? Is Shaheen taking you soon? Or?
Yeah, are we going?
You think the difference you get?
Good question, Jamie.
There is a classical tour to what we will be in Florence.
Yes. I think I have like 2 more cycles before I can go. So. Yeah. Thanks, guys. Thanks for coming.